Hello everybody. Today we're going to continue the Infinite Jest video series and we're starting on page 55. This is Autumn Year of Dairy Products from the American Heartland. So this is a year we actually haven't covered yet in the book. And we're starting off with a drug addict named Don Gately. And you may say to yourself, who's Don Gately? Well, we don't really know much about him yet, but we do have some mention of him already in this book. So if you remember, in the first chapter, this is page 17, as Hal is being whisked away to the psych ward, he talks about how I think of John Wayne, who would have won this year's Whataburger, standing watch in a mask as Donald Gately, and I dig up my father's head. So, yeah, so we basically don't really know anything about Hal and Don Gately's connection, but it seems like they do know each other at some point. And so let's get a little bit of backstory on Don Gately. Well, Don Gately is had went to jail for over 3 months, and he felt like he was wrongly incriminated against by a assistant district attorney, shortened ADA, and so he wanted to pay back this assistant district attorney. So he and his other drug friend Trent Kite go and burglar the house of this assistant district attorney. The assistant district attorney and his wife are out of the house, but they are able to take a couple of things. But for the most part, it looks like the burglary was kind of ruined because alarms went off. Donald Gately has a way of shunting the electricity to the house to have the alarms come on at a certain point. And so, with it looking like a botched burglary, the assistant district attorney and his wife come back, find their house burglared, and then go back to living in the house. And then a month later, the assistant district attorney in the mail gets a picture of Donald Gately and Trent Kite, the other drug addict who burglared the house, with the assistant district attorney and his wife's toothbrush up the rectum of both Don and Trent Kite rectum. So, basically it was Donald Gately's get even strategy to put their toothbrush up his rectum, and that was, the burglary wasn't the payback. It was the fact that he basically violated their hygiene, unbeknownst to them. And so, anyways, we switch off to Gately and Trent Kite also going on another burglary escapade in a different general area than where the assistant district attorney lived. And it was just an empty house. All the family's gone. The cars are gone. So they shunt the house. Donald Gately and Trent Kite go in. And as they're ransacking the house, they actually find that the whole family isn't gone. There is one member of the family there. And so Donald Gately says, all right, well, this is going to be bad because this isn't just a burglary. It's now going to be, somewhat like an attempted murder if we get caught. And so anyways, they decide to go ahead with it, and they end up tying this guy up. And unfortunately, this guy has a rhinovirus, so he has the flu essentially, and he can't breathe out of his nose. And Gately ties him up to a chair and then sticks kind of a dish towel in his mouth, and then make sure that the dish towel can't move by taping his mouth shut. And so this man actually ends up dying because he is left to suffocate while Donald Gately and Trent Kite keep stealing from the rest of the house. Now, there is a couple of interesting things at this point. For example, we know that in the process of stealing from the home, one of the things they stole was a state-of-the-art TP, a teleputer viewer, crammed with arty-looking film cartridges. So, they basically stole what would to us be a really big TV with a big collection of DVDs. But also in one of the footnotes of this chapter, it's clear that that insurgents from Quebec are are essentially having some kind of pursuit of Don Gately because of a cartridge. So it's unclear what the cartridge is. It's unclear kind of the timeline here, but it does make us assume that Don Gately and Trent Kite stole a cartridge from this man, and excuse me, and that one of the cartridges they stole was rather important. So, who is this man they kill? It could just be a nobody. Turns out it's not. And so on page 58, this man is the right-hand man to probably the most infamous anti-Onan organizer north of the Great Concavity. Okay, so basically, what that's kind of a complicated term that we haven't really gotten into, but he's also described as a Canadian terrorism coordinator, which is a really simple way to put it, which is to say he's kind of a mob boss of a bunch of Canadian terrorist groups. So this guy isn't somebody you really want to mess with, but they killed him accidentally. And so the name of this man is so it's basically William, but pronounced in French, Duplessis. And we have heard this man before. When we switch back to the chapter where Hal is meeting with the professional conversationalist, who turns out to be his dad has all of those rants, right? So we think he's crazy. But in one of those rants, he says, "Do you think that a professional plier of the trade of conversation would fail to probe, beak deep into your family's sordid liaison with the pan-Canadian resistance's notorious M. Duplessis and his malevolent but allegedly irresistible cum operative Luria P?" So basically, it's clear that whoever this man, Don Gately and Trent Kite, killed has some relationship to Hal and Hal's family. And so that kind of gives us an idea of how, at the beginning chapter, that Donald Gately and Hal could even end up in the same kind of plot. Okay, so what else from this? That is all for that chapter, actually. Basically, we're starting to learn a little bit about, Donald Gately and him getting into some kind of Canadian terrorism ordeal, and he really doesn't want to be a part of it, but he kind of roped himself into it by accidentally killing this man. Okay, so now we're at November 3rd, year of the Depend adult undergarment. So remember, this is the year where we've mainly had the plot be at, the year of the Depend adult undergarment, and this is November 3rd. So this is 1 month of the same year when we were covering Orin and him with the roaches and all that in a earlier chapter. So in this chapter, we're learning a bit about Jim Troeltsch, and he's 17, and he's basically talking about how he's getting ready to go play tennis and, practice for the day. And all of a sudden he just feels this, immediate sickness, and it totally takes him by surprise. And to me as a reader, I say to myself, this sounds like someone faking sick, because, you're fine getting up, ready to go, and then you're like, I can't do it. But it's unclear if he is faking sick, because he seems pretty convinced that he is sick. And so I think in a way he's kind of burnt out. An example of being burnt out, and he's not even kind of being honest with himself that he is burnt out. He just kind of reads it as, I'm sick, I can't do what I need to do today. And so what is really interesting is that he starts having this daydreaming sickness. And so on page 61, he says it's literally daydreaming sick. And then he starts talking about struggling to sit upright. He has these psychic clunks, so he's kind of mentally messed up. And then he says, convinced there's someone unauthorized in the dorm room with you. So that's kind of weird. It's just, how is this sickness leading to him thinking there's someone who's an intruder in the room? And then it goes to another kind of psychic clunk in the story, which is about this boy who wakes up in the middle of the night, and he kind of gets the feeling that someone shouldn't be here. And so on page 62, it says, there's a sudden feeling that there is a distillation of total evil in this dark, strange sub-dorm room with you. And one of the most frightening things for this boy is that the evil is specifically for them. No one else is even aware of this evil except you, and that's part of the reason why it's so terrifying. And then, so the boy turns on the flashlight, and he's looking around the room, and he sees the typical stuff, a doorknob, you see the vents, the ceiling, and then he sees a face in the floor. And this face is not happy, because it describes kind of these really angry eyebrows and a toothy smile, but kind of in a malicious way. And then this boy says, "Oh, mother, a face on the floor, mother, oh." So he's obviously shocked to see this face. And then this boy wakes up. So he was having a nightmare, and then he turns on the flashlight for real, and he's searching around the room and doesn't see the face, but he's kind of looking for it. And so when you read this, you would think to yourself, okay, well, Jim Troeltsch, who is 17, had that bad morning where he was getting ready for tennis and then got sick. And then the next paragraph, it's now nighttime, and so this kind of psychic clunking is now manifested to him seeing the face, which would represent the presence he felt within the room. However, that does not seem to be the case here because, as I said, Jim Troeltsch at the beginning of this chapter is 17. At the end of this chapter, it says the boy is awake and almost 12. So this is an 11-year-old boy. Obviously, it could still be Jim Troeltsch, but I think it's kind of David Foster Wallace's way of trying to trick us into thinking these two paragraphs are similar when really they're completely distinct, completely different timelines. And so I actually think that this is probably Hal. I think this, timing-wise, with him being almost 12, I think this could be within the range shortly after or perhaps very close to around the time when his dad died. We know that when he's meeting with his dad as the professional conversationalist, he talks about, I think he was saying he was about 10. So if you think that probably somewhere between that horrible interaction and 12, there could have been a range in which he died. So he could be thinking that, maybe his dad, his dad is kind of manifesting his evil presence in his life still, even after he's dead. It's kind of hard to say. But it is clear that this person is a little bit troubled and kind of trying to keep their eyes out for these evil presences in their life. Okay, so now we get into what is really a short chapter. It's basically 2 pages, but it is incredibly dense because it's got like an 8-page footnote. And so we obviously want to cover this in detail. And okay, so this is as of year of the dependent adult undergarment. So it's kind of unclear when the timeline of this is taking place, but we'll just go with it. So we're learning about Hal's dad. This is the James Orin Incandenza. So Hal's dad's middle name is Orin, and then the son is named Orin as well. So they basically just start talking about him, and James Incandenza was a really a smart guy. He had a lot of professional success. He had a doctorate in optical physics. He ended up having a lot of ideas that contributed to cold annular fusion, which led to, in part, the energy independence of both the United States and its allies. So, I mean, think about today, that would be a huge factor if we could have a unlimited source of energy for the nation. And then we get to footnote 24, and this is the doozy. So this is basically one of the most comprehensive lists of James Incandenza's life. And this is put together by other filmmakers in the field, and so that's kind of its reason for existing. But man, there is a lot to unpack here. And I can't go through it all, or else I would just be reading it. But essentially, this piece of text is covering the 12-year filmography career of James Incandenza. And he didn't really have a very lucrative career. If you look at the plot of his works, they're very strange, definitely aren't made to sell mass market. And so, what in here is important? Because there are things that I don't think are important, but what's in here? Okay, well, one of the big ones is on page 987, where he has the movie title called Widower, and he also has his his production name for the movie, and it's Latrodectus mactans, which, if you look up, is the species name for a black widow. Now, that's important because we have, widower, which would be kind of the idea that you're making a widow. And then black widow. Black widows are called such because they kill their significant other. So, kind of an interesting thing there. That obviously isn't there just for placeholder, if you know what I mean. So, what is this movie about? Well, it's described as being shot in location at Tucson, Arizona, and it's parody of broadcast television domestic comedies. A cocaine-addicted father, played by Watt. So this man was mentioned before as well, Cosgrove Watt. He was one of the men mentioned when we get that character dump by Hal Incandenza in chapter 1 as he's getting swept away to the psych ward. So like I said, a real character dump in the first chapter, and don't know why he was thinking of Cosgrove Watt at the time, but Cosgrove Watt, we now know, was a very, very kind of prominent actor in Hal's dad's work. Okay, so I'll reiterate just for the point. So a cocaine-addicted father leads his son around their desert property, immolating poisonous spiders. So, assuming the poisonous spiders are black widows here for a second, this to me sounds a little bit like the chapter that we read with Orin, because keep in mind that was Phoenix and this is Tucson, but they're both in Arizona. And what is really going on here? It's a father and son going around the desert, which Orin was in that chapter, and immolating or destroying widows. So, as I mentioned, Orin has a very complex relationship with women, and he was essentially either dating single moms with children or people with infidelities, but regardless, he was sending their children toys. So, maybe he was kind of causing that widowing. He himself was, trying to lure a woman out of her relationship and then destroying the widow. I don't know, but it's kind of interesting. And then the idea about a father teaching a son, it's almost like maybe Orin's dad taught him how to do this. I don't know. The second one is called Cage 2. It's another Latrodectus mactans productions, where a blind convict, played by Cosgrove Watt, and a deaf mute convict together in solitary confinement, and the two men attempt to devise ways of communicating with each other. So this to me sounds like a really strong reference to the professional conversationalist scene. And excuse me for a second. In that scene, Hal's dad felt like he was unable to even talk to Hal, and Hal thinks he's talking, and then Hal's dad isn't hearing anything, and so this having a blind person try to talk to a deaf person would obviously be very hard, and I think this is kind of elucidating how hard it was to, from the perspective of Hal's dad. So another one, and this is a theme throughout a lot of these movies, is talking about infidelity. So still on page 987, Fun with Teeth. It's a silent with non-human screams and howls, which that maybe I'm looking into this, but non-human screams and howls sounds a lot like how Hal was able to talk in the first chapter. Remember, people said he made sub-mammalian noises, which is kind of like screaming and howling. And I think that there's also a little bit of playing with the word here, because non-human screams and howls sounds a lot like Hal Incandenza. So just keep that in mind. But so the howling and screaming is coming from a person because a dentist is performing 16 unanesthetized root canal procedures on an academic he suspects of involvement with his wife. So there's that kind of, causing a lot of pain and horror onto somebody because there's the belief of infidelity. And I don't want to focus on that too much because I've already said that is a huge underlying germ of idea for these movies is infidelity all throughout. So what else is there? This is kind of sad. At the bottom of 987, Kinds of Pain movie. This is still frame close-ups of middle-aged white males suffering from almost every conceivable type of pain. From an ingrown toenail to craniofacial neuralgia, so that's chronic pain, to inoperable colorectal neoplastis, which is basically kind of a colon cancer. So, basically this movie sounds like it's Hal's dad screaming out that, he at least feels like he's suffering through the worst pain imaginable. And, gosh, I don't really know what else to cover because there's just so much in here. But I will cover one more. Excuse me. So the one that's important here, and it's a little bit different than the ones I've mentioned, is on the bottom of 988 called The Joke. And it's basically where you're at a fair and you're told, hey, do you want to see some people doing some really inhuman acts? It's, really entertaining. And so you go in, sit down, and you and the whole audience are so, entertained by this, you just turn into gigantic eyeballs. Then on the other side of the wall, the showgoer who invited you to that side of the wall, and then you turn into gigantic eyeballs, says, hey, do you want to see something interesting? People will turn into gigantic eyeballs right in front of your eyes. All you have to do is something really degrading. And so I think that, to me, is a little bit of a metaphor that we're going to get into about how the audience and the players of professional sports kind of feed off each other's entertainment in a way, but in a really negative way. And so that will be a theme, especially in the upcoming chapters. So basically, as you can tell, this is not your multi-million-dollar box office movies. This is some really kind of artsy stuff, and I think most of it, as mentioned throughout the text, is pretty pretty boring, pretty vapid, but there's also some pretty interesting stuff in there as well. And it's also mentioned in his list of works is Infinite Jest. So this is kind of the last movie he ever made was a bunch of renditions of Infinite Jest. And obviously this book is called Infinite Jest. And for me, it's almost like a way of showing um, the way David Foster Wallace is showing us that this book went through so many iterations, if we can kind of connect the dots a little bit. But as of right now, we don't really know much about what this infinite jest in the book means, just that it was one of the last things he made and it went through a lot of iterations. Okay, so that's the giant footnote there. So what is actually in the text here? Well, what we do know is a really interesting line here where we're on page 64 and he talks about, so this is Hal's dad, James, meeting his future wife, Avril, and talks about how one of the reasons why he was such a good candidate for marriage was that he was able to get, or she was able to get a green card. So that's pretty petty. And then at the end of this paragraph in 64, the birth of the Incandenza's first child, Orin, had been at least partly a legal maneuver. So, I don't know how much communication there was between Avril and James as to was this just kind of like, hey, you scratch my back, I scratch yours, or was Avril really taking advantage of James, Hal's dad? So it's just very weird. Another thing is that in college, it's mentioned that Avril, so Hal's mom, was kind of interacting with some seedy crowds. She was interacting in graduate school with Quebec separatist left movement, which actually got her onto sign a kind of a list of people you want to like terrorist watch list, basically, is how I read it. And so, she says that, it was a nonviolent group and all that. But we're now kind of getting to understand how maybe Hal's family could have a sordid liaison with Quebec separatist groups that Hal's dad was talking about when he was going off on a rant in the professional conversationalist chapter. So, yeah, it's just so much in here. So basically, at the end of his life, James Incandenza ended up losing control of the thing he built, which is the Enfield Tennis Academy, and it went into the control of Avril's half brother, who is called Uncle Charles Tavis. And so basically, he had an untimely suicide, and it caused quite a big rift in a lot of people's life. Even it's mentioned that in at least 3 worlds, it caused an impact. And one was with the President of the United States, President J. Gentle, due to the contribution of James' work with causing that cold annular fusion and having an energy source and energy production for the United States. He was, really missed by kind of the establishment of America. And then he was missed by the film group. He didn't have a big following, but he still was kind of seen as having contributions to the film field. And then also at the students at the Enfield Tennis Academy, it was mentioned that that the students whose arms could fit into armbands wore black bands on court for almost a year to kind of show solidarity that their headmaster had died. So, yeah, so I feel like we need to kind of wrap up some thoughts on this section because it's all over the place, but let's hit the highlights. So what do we have? We have Don Gately, Trent Kite, burglared a home and killed a guy accidentally. It ended up being a man named Duplessis. This Duplessis we know is the mob boss of Canadian terrorist groups. Okay, fine. That causes what we don't really know about, but it causes kind of Quebec separatist terrorists to want to chase down the cartridges Don Gately stole. Then we have Hal probably seeing faces in the ground that really freaks him out, and he kind of is searching for that evil in his life. Third, then we have a little bit about James' life. It seems like he was kind of trying to tell a biography of his life throughout his films, and also that he met Avril. She does have connections to Canadian terrorist groups. Whether or not that involvement is direct or not, we don't know. But it kind of seems like their marriage did cause his untimely suicide. So that's where we're at now. And so we're going to continue next time.